The marriage contract was a document of profound and meticulous cruelty. It was not cruel in its demands, which were, on the surface, quite reasonable. It was cruel in its precision. 12 pages of dense, spidery script outlining not a union of hearts, but a transaction of assets. Clara Ashworth, aged 24, spinster of the parish of St. Giles, was to be exchanged for the complete and total erasure of her father's debts. The sum was staggering, enough to have seen him clapped in debtor's prison for the remainder of his natural life. In return, she would become Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackwood. She would receive a title, a home, and a generous personal allowance. She would be mistress of Blackwood Manor, a sprawling estate in the wilds of Northumberland she had only ever seen as a severe-looking etching in a book of country seats. She would be expected to manage the household accounts, oversee the staff, and represent the ducal seat with the appropriate level of decorum and dignity. The final clause, on page 11, was the true heart of the matter. It was written in the same neat hand as the rest, yet the words seemed colder, heavier. The party of the first part, Miss Clara Ashworth, agrees and accepts that the party of the second part, His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood, maintains a life of profound seclusion. She shall not question his habits, his schedule, or his preference for solitude. Furthermore, she shall make no inquiry, comment, nor demonstration of surprise or revulsion regarding his physical person, most particularly the perpetual wearing of a mask of dark metal which covers the left portion of his countenance. A cage, not of iron bars, but of paper and ink. Clara placed the document back on the worn mahogany of her father's desk. He sat opposite her, his shoulders slumped, his scholar's hands clasped together as if in prayer. The room smelled of old books and quiet desperation. For years she had watched the slow, inexorable decline of their fortunes. Her father, a kind man with a brilliant mind for ancient languages and a disastrous one for finance, had sunk them into a mire of debt from which there was no escape. "You do not have to do this, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with a shame that was more painful for her to witness than any poverty. She looked at him, at the fraying cuffs of his coat, the tremor in his hand as he reached for his cold cup of tea. She thought of the threatening letters, the looming spectre of Newgate, the humiliation that would shatter this gentle, unworldly man. Her own life, a quiet succession of making do, of turning gowns and placating shopkeepers, had prepared her for this. It was simply a larger, more permanent form of management. "It is a solution, Papa," she said, her own voice steady. It was a point of pride, that steadiness. She had learned a long time ago that tears were a luxury they could not afford. A practical solution. He shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the dust of his despair. To be shackled to a monster, a ghost. That is what they call him. The Iron Duke. Not for his will, but for his face. The Duke of Blackwood. Alistair, Duke of Blackwood. The name was a legend whispered in London drawing rooms, a Gothic tale to frighten debutantes. A man of brilliant promise, handsome and lauded, who at the age of 22 had been consumed by the fire that destroyed the ancient library at Blackwood Manor and killed his own father. The son had survived. Barely. He had emerged from the flames a different creature, a recluse who had not been seen in society for 12 long years. He was said to be horribly disfigured, a phantom who haunted his own estate, his face hidden behind a mask of polished iron. Clara picked up a pen. Its weight was familiar in her hand. She signed her name, Clara Ashworth, at the bottom of the 12th page. The ink was a stark black finality. She was no longer just her father's daughter. She was a commodity, sold and paid for. She was to be a duchess. She was to be the wife of a ghost. She did not feel fear. She did not feel sorrow. She felt a strange, hollow calm. It was done. The slow, suffocating dread of their poverty was gone, replaced by a new, unknown quantity. She had traded one cage for another. The only question was whether this new one would have a wider view. The journey north was a slow shedding of skins. First, the bustling, clamorous skin of London. Then the manicured green of the home counties. The farther the carriage travelled, the wilder the landscape became. The neat hedgerows gave way to ancient stone walls, the rolling hills to sweeping, heather-clad moors that seemed to swallow the sky. The air grew colder, sharper, tasting of salt and damp earth. Clara watched the world change through the carriage window. She had packed little. Her wardrobe consisted mostly of practical gowns in shades of grey, brown, and a deep, unassuming blue. She had brought her books, a small sewing kit, and a leather-bound journal filled with her neat, precise handwriting. They were the tools of her life, the small anchors of her identity. Blackwood Manor appeared as the dusk began to settle, not so much built upon the land as having grown out of it. It was a vast, imposing structure of dark grey stone, its mullioned windows like watchful eyes. It was not sinister, not in the way of Gothic novels. It was simply immense and silent. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel of the drive, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. The great oak doors swung open before the footman could even reach them. A woman stood framed in the doorway, ramrod straight, her silver hair pulled into a severe knot. She wore a black silk dress that rustled like dry leaves. "I am Mrs. Elmsley," she announced, her voice as crisp as a winter morning. "The housekeeper. You are expected." There was no warmth in the greeting, only a stark statement of fact. Clara stepped out of the carriage, her simple travelling cloak suddenly feeling thin and inadequate. The hall was cavernous, the flagstones beneath her feet worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The air was cool and smelled of beeswax and wood smoke. High above, dark portraits watched her progress, their painted eyes seeming to follow her. Another figure detached itself from the shadows near a towering fireplace. An old woman, leaning on an ebony cane, her face a web of fine wrinkles. She was dressed in antiquated but expensive lace, and a pair of startlingly intelligent blue eyes fixed on Clara with unnerving intensity. "And so you are the girl," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "You have a good chin. I approve of a good chin. Shows character. I am Augusta Mortmain, the Duke's great-aunt, and the architect of this arrangement." Clara curtsied. "Lady Augusta, dispense with the formalities. We shall be living in each other's pockets. You may call me Augusta. I shall call you Clara. You look sensible. Thank God for that. The last thing this house needs is a flight of hysterics." Lady Augusta's eyes swept over Clara's simple grey dress. Sensible and plain. Excellent. Less to distract him. Clara felt a flicker of something, not quite anger, but a cool spark of defiance. "My gown is practical for travel, my lady." A dry chuckle. "It is, and it will be practical for life here. This is not London. We do not stand on ceremony. We stand on survival." She gestured with her cane towards the grand, sweeping staircase. "Mrs. Elmsley will show you to your rooms. They are in the east wing. The Dukes are in the west. A very separate arrangement." The east wing was a world away from the somber grandeur of the main hall. The rooms were light, with tall windows overlooking a walled garden that, even in the encroaching autumn, showed signs of meticulous care. The furniture was elegant, if a little faded. It was clear that this was the domain of the Duchess, a space kept in readiness for a woman who had never come, until now. A young maid named Mary helped her unpack, her movements silent and efficient, her eyes wide with a nervous curiosity she tried to hide. Clara learned more from the maid's careful silences than from any direct question. She learned that the staff revered the Duke, that they were fiercely protective of him, that his word was law, and that his seclusion was absolute. He took his meals alone. He walked the grounds only at dawn or after dusk. He spent his days in the West Wing, a part of the house the staff rarely entered. That evening, dinner was announced. Clara smoothed the bodice of her best blue gown, a simple silk that had cost her 3 months of pin money 2 years ago. She felt a tremor in her hands for the first time. This was it. The meeting. The dining room was a study in magnificent gloom. A table that could comfortably seat 30 was set for 2, one at each end, separated by a vast expanse of polished mahogany that reflected the flickering candlelight like a dark, still lake. Lady Augusta was already seated, a glass of claret at her elbow. "He will be down shortly," she said, not looking at Clara. "Do not stare. Do not startle. Do not speak unless spoken to. And for the love of God, do not offer him your pity. He can abide anything but that." Clara took her seat. The silence stretched. 1 minute. 2. Then the sound of a single set of footsteps, steady and unhurried, on the marble floor of the hall. He entered the room. He was a silhouette against the candlelight from the hall. Tall, broader in the shoulders than she had expected. He moved with a strange, contained grace, no hint of weakness or injury in his stride. He wore a coat of severe black wool, perfectly tailored. And the mask. It was not the crude iron plate of her imagination. It was a work of dark, intricate art. Polished steel, shaped to the contours of the left side of his face, from his hairline to his jaw. It covered his eye, his cheek, his mouth on that side. It was smooth, featureless, reflecting the candlelight in a single cold gleam. The right side of his face was in shadow, but she could see a strong jaw, the firm line of a mouth, a dark, thick eyebrow. He took his seat at the far end of the table without a word. He did not look at her. The first course was served by silent footmen. Soup. The only sound was the faint click of spoons against porcelain. Clara kept her eyes on her plate. She could feel his presence, a weight at the other end of the room. It was not a menacing weight. It was a dense, compacted gravity, the feeling of a man who had pulled the entire world into the small, dark space he inhabited. She ate her soup. She ate the fish that followed. She ate the roast beef. She did not look up. The silence was a 4th person at the table, a guest with terrible manners. It was Lady Augusta who finally broke it. "The steward reports that the North tenants are concerned about the damp in their cottages," she said, her voice aimed down the table at the Duke. A pause. Then a voice, low and with a rough, gravelly texture, as if it were unused. "See to it." 2 words, the first she had ever heard him speak. "They will require new thatch before the winter rains," Augusta pressed. Then give them new thatch. 4 more words. Clara risked a glance. He was looking at his great-aunt, his visible eye in shadow. She could read nothing in his posture. After what felt like an eternity, the meal concluded. The Duke rose, gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod in Augusta's direction, and left the room as silently as he had entered. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Lady Augusta took a slow sip of her claret. "Well," she said, her sharp eyes on Clara, "you didn't scream. You didn't faint. You didn't burst into tears. A promising start." Clara met her gaze. "He is my husband," she said, the words feeling foreign and strange on her tongue. Augusta's expression softened for a fraction of a second. "He is," she said, "and this is your home now, for better or for worse." That night, alone in the vast, canopied bed, Clara lay awake and listened to the sounds of the house. The groan of old timbers, the sigh of the wind in the chimney, the distant, lonely cry of an owl. It was the sound of a profound and terrible solitude. And now, she was a part of it. She thought of the man at the other end of the house, the man with the steel mask, and the voice like stones grinding together. She did not feel afraid. She felt a vast, aching curiosity. Who was the man behind the iron mask? The first week at Blackwood Manor passed in a haze of quiet routine. Clara and her husband lived as ghosts in the same house, their paths rarely crossing. They saw each other only at dinner, 2 silent figures at opposite ends of the long, gleaming table. He never spoke to her. He never looked at her. He simply existed, a dark, brooding presence in her peripheral vision. Clara, however, was not one for idleness. She had been given a duty, and she would perform it. On the 3rd day, she requested the household account books from Mrs. Elmsley. The housekeeper, her expression a careful mask of neutrality, presented them in the morning room. The ledgers were immaculate, the columns of figures precise. But they told a story of neglect. The estate was running on inertia. Tradesmen's bills were paid late. Rents were collected sporadically. The gardens, though beautiful, were wildly over budget, while the tenant farms were clearly starved of investment. It was an estate without a mistress, run by a master who had retreated from the world. Clara set to work. She spent her mornings in the small study adjoining her rooms, a space she quickly claimed as her own. She wrote letters. She tallied figures. She began to draw up a new budget, one that reallocated funds from ornamental luxuries to practical necessities. She did not ask for permission. The marriage contract had given her dominion over the household, and she intended to exercise it. She began to learn the geography of the house and its inhabitants. She knew that Mrs. Elmsley was in the kitchens every morning at 6, that the maid Mary was curious but kind, that the head gardener, a taciturn man named Thomas, was fiercely proud of his roses, but resentful of any questions about his budget. The house itself felt different at different times of day. In the morning, it was full of the quiet bustle of the staff. In the afternoon, it fell into a deep, listening silence. At night, it felt ancient and full of memories. One afternoon, driven by a need for air, she ventured into the gardens. They were magnificent and slightly wild, a riot of late-blooming flowers and tangled vines. She followed a path that led away from the house towards a dense wood. And there, she found the ruin. It was the shell of a building, one wing of what must have been a magnificent structure. The stone was blackened and scorched. Empty window frames gaped like skulls' eyes. This was it, the old library, the site of the fire. A wave of cold passed over her, despite the mild afternoon sun. She could almost smell the smoke, hear the roar of the flames. This was where the Duke's life had been shattered, where he had been remade into the man with the mask. She backed away slowly, feeling like an intruder on sacred, sorrowful ground. That evening at dinner, something was different. The silence was the same. The distance was the same. But as she ate, she felt his eyes on her. She did not look up, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. It was not hostile. It was questioning. The next day she made her first move. It was a small rebellion. Before dinner, she sought out Lady Augusta. "Augusta," she began, her voice calm but firm. "I find the dining arrangements to be inefficient." The old woman raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Inefficient?" "Yes. It is a great deal of work for the footman to traverse such a distance, and the food grows cold. I should like a smaller table to be brought into the room. A round one, perhaps." Lady Augusta stared at her for a long moment. A slow smile spread across her wrinkled face. "An excellent idea, my dear. Practical, sensible. I shall see to it." When Clara entered the dining room that evening, the long, intimidating table was gone. In its place was a handsome, circular table, large enough for four, but intimate. Lady Augusta was already seated. When the Duke entered, he stopped dead in the doorway. He stood there for a long, silent moment, taking in the new arrangement. Clara held her breath. She expected him to turn and leave, to retreat back to his solitude. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. He walked to the table and took the seat opposite her. The distance between them had shrunk from 30 feet to 4. The silence was no longer a vast, empty expanse. It was a thick, charged presence. She could see the details of his coat, the fine linen of his cravat. She could see the rigid set of his jaw on the unmasked side of his face. They ate. The silence remained unbroken. But it was a different silence. It was a shared silence. When the meal was over, he rose, and for the first time, his gaze flicked to her, a brief, unreadable glance from his one visible eye, before he turned and left. It was a victory. A small one, but a victory nonetheless. She had made a change in his world, and he had not rejected it. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The library became her sanctuary. The main library, the one that had burned, remained a sealed and silent tomb at the end of the West Wing. But a smaller, more intimate library had been built in the East Wing. It was a beautiful room, lined with books from floor to ceiling, with a comfortable chair by the fire. It was the one place in the house where Clara felt she could breathe. She spent her evenings there, reading, writing in her journal, or simply staring into the flames. One night, a week after the incident with the dining table, she was engrossed in a book of architectural drawings when she felt a change in the room. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway, a dark shape against the hall's dim light. He did not move, did not speak. He simply watched her. Her heart gave a sudden, sharp thump against her ribs. This was her space, her sanctuary. He had never come to the East Wing before. She did not speak. She did not invite him in. She simply met his gaze, then deliberately looked back down at her book, her heart beating a steady rhythm against the quiet fear. She would not be chased from her own room. After a long moment, she heard his soft footstep as he retreated. But he came back the next night, and the night after that. He would stand in the doorway for a few minutes, a silent observer before disappearing again. It became a strange, unspoken ritual. Then, one evening, he stepped inside. He walked to a shelf on the far side of the room, pulled out a book, and sat in a chair in the shadows, far from the firelight. Clara's hands tightened on her own book. The room, which had been her solitary refuge, now held two people. The silence was thick with unspoken things. She tried to read, but the words blurred. She was acutely aware of him, of the faint sound of a page turning, of the sheer weight of his presence. This became the new routine. They would sit in the library together in the evenings, in silence, separated by a dozen feet of carpet and a universe of pain. One afternoon, driven by a need to understand, Clara found Lady Augusta in the drawing room, doing a piece of intricate embroidery. "Augusta," she began, choosing her words with care. "The old library. What happened?" Augusta's needle paused. She looked up, her blue eyes sharp and piercing. "You want to know about the fire?" It was not a question. "I want to understand," Clara said quietly. Augusta set her embroidery aside. It was 12 years ago. Alistair was 22. He and his father, the old Duke, were scholars at heart. They were in the library late one night, arguing over some dusty manuscript, as they often did. A lamp was overturned. The old wing was tinder dry. The fire was explosive. Her voice grew quiet. Alistair tried to save his father. He went back in. The roof collapsed. The footman pulled Alistair out. He was barely alive. The old Duke. They did not find him until the next day. Alistair blames himself, not just for the fire, but for failing to save his father. "And the mask?" Clara whispered. "The burns were severe. The doctors did what they could. When he finally looked in a mirror, something in him broke. He had been a handsome boy, you see, vain as young men are. He commissioned the mask himself. A barrier, a wall. He has not let anyone see his face since. Not even me." Clara looked out the window at the bleak, beautiful landscape. It all made a terrible kind of sense. The silence, the solitude, the mask. They were not just affectations. They were his armor and his prison. That night in the library, she saw him not as a ghost or a monster, but as a man drowning in grief. He sat in his usual chair in the shadows, a book open on his lap, though she doubted he was reading. She felt an overwhelming urge to go to him, to say something, anything. But she remembered Augusta's warning. He can abide anything but pity. So she did nothing. She simply sat with him, sharing the silence. And for the first time, it did not feel empty. It felt like a vigil. A few days later, a small, perfect white rose appeared on the silver tray that held her morning tea. There was no note. Mary, the maid, professed complete ignorance. But Clara knew. She had seen the same rare, perfect blooms in the Duke's private greenhouse, a glass sanctuary he tended himself. She took the rose and pressed its cool petals to her cheek. It was a message, sent across the silent expanse of their shared house. A single, fragile word. From his study in the West Wing, Alistair watched her. He had a powerful spyglass he sometimes used to observe the deer on the high moors. But more often, he found himself training it on the figure of his wife. He watched her as she walked in the gardens, her grey cloak a soft smudge of colour against the greens and browns. He watched her as she spoke to the gardener, her posture calm and assured. He had expected hysterics, or revulsion, or cloying pity. He had expected a simpering girl who would either fear him or try to fix him. He had not expected Clara Ashworth. She moved through his house, not like an intruder, but like a quiet force of nature. She had taken over the accounts, and for the first time in a decade, the estate was being managed with a firm, intelligent hand. She had shortened the dining table, a move so audacious in its simplicity that it had left him momentarily speechless. And she had met his presence, his silence, his very monstrosity, with a calm, unwavering gaze that saw him without staring. She never tried to glimpse the left side of his face. When she looked at him, which was rare, her eyes met his, visible one directly. She gave him the dignity of not being a curiosity. He had been watching her that afternoon. She'd found the ruined library. He had seen her from his window, seen the way she stopped, the way she looked at the scorched stones. He had felt a familiar, cold dread, waiting for the inevitable gasp of horror. But she had only looked sad. Then she had retreated, as if sensing she was treading on holy ground. That night, when he had found her in the new library, he had fully intended to order her out. The libraries of Blackwood were his domain, but she had looked up at him, her heart in her eyes, for a fleeting second. And then she had looked back down at her book. She had not been cowed. She had held her ground. And something in him, some long-dormant part of his soul, had respected it. The nightly ritual in the library had become the anchor of his day. Her quiet presence was a balm. She asked nothing of him. She demanded nothing. She simply was, a steady, warm light in the corner of his vast, dark world. The rose had been an impulse, a mad, reckless impulse. He had seen it blooming in the greenhouse, a single perfect flower, and he had thought of her. He had cut it and had the undergardener place it on her tray. A silent, clumsy gesture he could not put into words. He had spent 12 years building walls around himself, walls of stone, of silence, of steel, and this quiet woman, with her grey gowns and her steady gaze, was dismantling them brick by brick, without even seeming to try. It was terrifying, and it was the first thing that had made him feel alive in a very, very long time. Clara's work on the household accounts led her to the estate office, a dusty room near the kitchens that had clearly not been used in years. There, in a stack of old ledgers, she found records of the tenants and a note from the steward about the late Duke's portrait. It had been damaged by smoke in the fire and removed to storage. On an impulse, she asked Mrs. Elmsley to have it brought out. It was a magnificent painting of a handsome, smiling man who looked remarkably like the unmasked side of his son's face. The canvas was dark with soot and grime. Clara hired a restorer from the nearby town of Alnwick. He worked for a week in a closed-off room. When it was done, the portrait was transformed. The colours were vibrant, the Duke's father's eyes full of life and intelligence. Clara had it hung in the main hall, in a place of honour, with a new, better source of light. She did not mention it. She simply waited. That evening, Alistair stopped in the hall on his way to the dining room. He stood before the portrait of his father for a full 5 minutes, his head bowed. Clara, watching from the doorway of the drawing room, saw his shoulders shake just once. At dinner, he looked at her, a long, direct look, and for the first time, from across the small table, he spoke to her directly. "Thank you," he said. His voice was still rough, but the gravelly edge was softer. Clara simply inclined her head. "He looks like a kind man." "He was," Alistair said, and then he fell silent again. But the silence was different now. It was filled with the memory of a shared moment, a grief acknowledged, a kindness returned. The quiet rhythm of their life was shattered by the arrival of a letter. It came on a crisp October morning. The envelope a startling shade of lilac, the wax seal bearing a flamboyant crest. It was addressed to the Duke. At dinner that evening, Alistair was more withdrawn than he had been in weeks. He barely touched his food. The tension coming from him was a palpable thing. "You had a letter," Lady Augusta stated, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Alistair placed his fork down. "From Lady Seraphina Vane." Augusta's lips thinned into a grim line. "I see. And what does that harpy want?" "She has heard of my marriage," he said, the word sounding stiff and unnatural. "She's in the north, visiting relatives. She has invited herself to Blackwood, to renew an old acquaintance." Clara looked from Augusta's thunderous expression to the rigid line of Alistair's back. She did not know the name, but she could feel the history, heavy and unwelcome in the air. "Seraphina Vane," Augusta said, her voice dripping with disdain, "was the woman Alistair was engaged to be married to. Before the fire." The pieces clicked into place. The beautiful, celebrated fiancée, who had vanished when her handsome Duke was transformed into a monster. "She jilted him," Augusta said, her voice cold as ice. "Sent back the ring with a note so cruel it might as well have been dipped in acid. And now she wants to renew an acquaintance. She smells a duchess's coronet and wants to see what she threw away. You must refuse her, Alistair." Alistair was silent for a long moment. "I cannot," he said, his voice flat. "Her cousin is Lord Danby. To refuse her would be a direct insult, and he is influential, politically. So you will allow that viper into this house?" "She will arrive in 3 days," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He pushed his chair back and left the room without another word. Clara sat in the ensuing silence, a cold knot forming in her stomach. A storm was coming to Blackwood. A storm of silks and perfumes and cruel, honeyed words. A storm named Seraphina. Lady Seraphina Vane did not so much arrive as descend. Her carriage was a gaudy confection of lacquer and gilt, her servants a flurry of motion and noise that shattered the estate's hard-won peace. She herself was a vision in emerald green silk, a cloud of expensive French perfume preceding her. She was beautiful, there was no denying it, with hair the colour of spun gold and eyes the blue of a summer sky. A perfect, flawless doll. She swept into the great hall, her gaze taking in everything, assessing and dismissing it all in a single glance. She greeted Lady Augusta with a kiss to the air beside her cheek. "Augusta, darling, you look exactly the same." It was not a compliment. Her eyes then fell on Clara, who stood quietly beside the older woman. Seraphina's perfect smile tightened by a fraction of a degree. She let her gaze travel from the top of Clara's simple brown wool dress to its sensible hem. "And you must be the new addition," she purred. "The Duke's little grey mouse. How charming." "Welcome to Blackwood, Lady Seraphina," Clara said, her voice even. She would not let this woman see a single crack in her composure. "Oh, it feels like coming home," Seraphina sighed, though she had never been to the manor. Her engagement had been a London affair. "I have thought of dear Alistair so often over the years. My heart has quite bled for him. I simply had to come and see that he was being well cared for." Her gaze lingered on Clara again, sharp and dismissive. Alistair appeared at the top of the stairs. He had not come down to greet her. He stood there, a dark, forbidding figure, his mask catching the light. "Seraphina," he said. The single word was flat, devoid of any warmth. Seraphina's face lit up with a brilliant, false smile. "Alistair, my dearest boy. Oh, look at you, so tall and mysterious. It is all terribly romantic, isn't it?" She glided towards the staircase, her hand outstretched. "Come, let me see you." He did not move. He did not take her hand. "Mrs. Elmsley will show you to your rooms," he said. "They have been prepared." Seraphina's smile faltered for a second, a flicker of anger in her blue eyes. But she recovered instantly. "Of course. I am quite exhausted from my journey. We shall have a lovely, long chat later. We have so much to catch up on." With a final, glittering smile, she allowed Mrs. Elmsley to lead her away, leaving a trail of perfume and tension in her wake. The house felt different with her in it, violated. Her laughter, high and brittle, echoed in the halls. She treated the staff with a casual disdain that set Clara's teeth on edge. She filled the quiet rooms with chatter, an endless stream of London gossip and thinly veiled insults. Her primary target was Clara. She treated her not as the Duchess, but as a hired companion. "My dear," she said at luncheon the next day, "that gown is a perfectly dreadful colour on you. It makes you look quite sallow. You must allow my maid to help you. Though I suppose there is only so much one can do." Clara merely smiled. "I find the colour practical, Lady Seraphina. Practicality is the last resort of the plain, my dear." Seraphina's cruelty was a performance. She was constantly trying to bait Alistair, to draw him out, to remind him of the man he had been and the life they had almost shared. "Do you remember, Alistair," she would say at dinner, "that ball at Vauxhall? You were so handsome in your uniform. Every girl in London was in love with you, especially me." Alistair would remain silent, his posture rigid, the steel of his mask seeming to grow colder. Clara could feel the effort it cost him to remain at the table, to endure this assault of memory and insinuation. She found herself becoming his shield. When Seraphina's talk became too pointed, Clara would calmly change the subject, asking a question about the estate, or mentioning a book she had read. She drew the fire, absorbing the barbs with a quiet dignity that seemed to infuriate Seraphina even more than open defiance would have. Alistair noticed. He began to watch the exchanges between the two women, his visible eye moving from Seraphina's glittering, malicious smile to Clara's calm, composed face. A silent battle was being waged at his dinner table, and the quiet woman in the grey dress was winning. One evening, Seraphina went too far. "Oh, this dreary mask, Alistair," she sighed dramatically, reaching a hand across the table as if to touch it. "It is so morbid. Why don't you take it off? Just for a little while. For me?" Alistair flinched back, a sharp, violent movement. "Do not," he said, his voice a low growl of warning. "He does not remove it," Clara said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of an order. "You will not ask him again." Seraphina turned to her, her eyes blazing with fury. "And who are you to give me orders? You are a nobody, a placeholder. He married you for convenience. He loved me." "He married me," Clara said, meeting her gaze without wavering. "I am his wife. I am the Duchess of Blackwood, and this is my house. You are a guest here, Lady Seraphina. I suggest you remember that." The silence that followed was absolute. Seraphina stared at her, speechless for the first time since her arrival. Lady Augusta hid a smile behind her wine glass. Alistair pushed his chair back and stood, He looked at Clara, a long, searching look. Then he turned and walked out of the room. Later that night, Clara was in the library. She was too agitated to read. She stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit garden. She heard the door open and turned, expecting the silent presence of her husband. He was there, but this time he did not linger in the shadows. He walked towards her, stopping a few feet away. "I am sorry," he said. The words, so simple, so direct, startled her. "For what?" "For her. For this. I should not have allowed her to come." "You had no choice," Clara said. "There is always a choice," he answered. His voice bitter. He looked past her, out the window. "She's right, you know, about why I married you. It was a contract, a way to secure the estate, to have a presence in the house that was not a servant. It was practical." "I know," Clara said softly. "It was practical for me too." He turned to look at her then, his visible eye searching her face in the dim light. "Why do you do it?" "Do what?" "Defend me, protect me. You have no reason to." Clara thought for a moment, searching for the honest answer. "When I first came here," she began, "I saw this house as a cage, a comfortable one, but a cage nonetheless. I saw you as my keeper." She took a breath. "I was wrong. You are in a cage of your own, a much crueler one. I suppose. I do not like to see anyone caged, Your Grace." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The almost. "My name is Alistair." The sound of his name, spoken by him, was an intimacy that stole her breath. "Why did you marry me, Clara?" he asked, his voice softer now. "The truth. The truth is that my father was ruined," she said simply. "Your offer saved him from disgrace and prison. It was my duty. And now?" he pressed, his gaze intense. "Is it still your duty?" She looked at him, at the proud, lonely man before her, at the ridiculous, heartbreaking mask that hid half his face. She thought of the rose, of the portrait, of his silent presence in this room, night after night. "No," she whispered. "Now. It is my home." He held her gaze for a long, silent moment. The space between them crackled with everything that had not been said. He took a half step towards her, his hand lifting slightly, as if to reach for her. Why had he stopped? Why hadn't he continued? But the moment was broken by the sound of footsteps in the hall. He stiffened, the brief warmth in his eye vanishing, replaced by the familiar, cold shield. He turned without another word and was gone, leaving Clara alone with the ghost of a touch and the echo of her own heart. Serafina was losing, and she knew it. The quiet little mouse was not cowed. The Duke was not falling back under her spell. He was, if anything, moving further away, into the quiet orbit of his strange, dowdy wife. Serafina's visit, which she had imagined as a triumphant reclamation, was becoming a humiliation. She needed to force the issue, to create a crisis that would shatter the fragile peace of Blackwood and expose Clara for the nobody she was. Her solution was a dinner party. "Just a few of the local gentry," she announced, with a bright, false smile. "The Barringtons and the Fenwicks. They are dying to meet the new Duchess. And of course, to see you again, Alistair. It is your duty to entertain your neighbours, after all." She had framed it perfectly. To refuse would be a public snub, causing exactly the kind of political ripple Alistair wished to avoid. He agreed, his voice tight with reluctance. Clara felt a sense of foreboding. Serafina was planning something. This was not a social gathering. It was a battlefield of her choosing. The night of the dinner party, The house was ablaze with light. Clara dressed with care, choosing a gown of deep midnight blue velvet. It was simple, but the fabric was rich and the cut was elegant. With her dark hair coiled neatly at the nape of her neck, she looked not fashionable, but timeless. She looked like a duchess. When she came downstairs, she found Alistair waiting in the hall. He was dressed in formal black, a diamond pin glittering in his cravat. He turned as she approached, and his visible eye widened almost imperceptibly. He said nothing, but she saw it. The appreciation, the surprise. Serafina was a vision in shimmering gold silk, a diamond tiara sparkling in her hair. She looked, Clara thought, like a magnificent bird of prey. The guests arrived, Sir John and Lady Barrington, and Mr. and Mrs. Fenwick. They were pleasant country gentry, clearly intimidated by the Duke, and overwhelmingly curious about his new wife. Clara greeted them with a calm grace that immediately put them at their ease. She was a poised and competent hostess, a fact that did not go unnoticed by Serafina, whose smile became progressively tighter. Dinner was an exercise in tension. Serafina dominated the conversation, telling witty, scandalous stories of London society, each one a subtle reminder of the world Alistair had lost. She repeatedly drew attention to his silence, his mask, his seclusion, framing it all as a romantic tragedy for which she was the only possible cure. He was the most wonderful dancer, she sighed to Lady Barrington, her eyes on Alistair. We were to lead the waltz at our wedding ball. Can you imagine? Alistair's hand tightened around the stem of his wine-glass. Clara saw his knuckles turn white. She calmly steered the conversation back to Northumberland, asking Sir John about his horse breeding, a topic on which he was happy to expound at great length. Finally, as the dessert was being served, Serafina made her move. She let a small, theatrical silence fall, drawing all eyes to her. "You know," she began, her voice full of a sweet, manufactured sympathy, "I have been thinking. All of us here are friends. We have known Alistair for years. And you, Duchess," she said, her eyes glittering at Clara, "are his wife. This charade is simply tiresome." She turned the full force of her beauty on Alistair. "Oh, Alistair, my dearest, for my sake, for the sake of old times, won't you take off that dreary mask? Let us see the man we all remember." The air in the room froze. The guests stared at their plates, mortified. Lady Augusta's face was a mask of cold fury. This was it, the public humiliation, the final cruel stroke. Clara did not look at her husband. She could feel his shame, his rage, his utter mortification radiating across the table. It was a physical force. She set her spoon down with a quiet click. She looked directly at Serafina, her gaze clear and cold as a winter stream. "Lady Serafina," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "You mistake the purpose of the mask." Serafina gave a brittle laugh. "Do I? It seems perfectly obvious to me." "No," Clara said. "You believe it is there to hide my husband from the world. From you." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "It is not. It is there to protect him from the cruelty of people who cannot see the man for the title, or the soul for the scars." The silence that followed was profound. It was a silence of shock, of revelation. Sir John Barrington coughed. Lady Fenwick's fan stilled in her hand. Serafina's face, for the first time, was stripped of its beauty. It was pale, pinched, and ugly with hate. "How dare you?" she hissed. But no one was looking at her. Everyone was looking at the Duke. Alistair sat perfectly still. 1 second. 2. 3. He had not moved, had not flinched. He was looking at Clara, and in the depths of his one visible eye, she saw a storm of emotion. Gratitude. Astonishment. And something else. Something fierce and tender and new. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand. Not to his mask. He reached across the small space between them, his fingers brushing hers. And then, in front of his guests, his great-aunt, and the woman who had tried to destroy him, he took his wife's hand in his. He held it firmly, a silent, unshakable declaration on the white linen of the tablecloth for all to see. Then he turned his head, his full unmasked side towards Clara, a gesture of profound trust. He spoke to her, his voice low and clear, ignoring everyone else in the room, as if they had ceased to exist. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her name in front of anyone. "Thank you." The battle was over. The quiet woman in the blue velvet dress had won. The dinner party broke up in a flurry of awkward goodbyes. The guests, deeply uncomfortable, made their excuses and fled, leaving a wake of shattered social convention. Serafina remained seated, her face a pale, furious mask. She said nothing. There was nothing left to say. She had played her final card and lost the game entirely. Lady Augusta rose, leaning on her cane. She looked at Serafina with utter contempt. "Your carriage will be ready at dawn, my dear," she said, her voice like chipping ice. "Do not let us keep you." She then turned, gave Clara a look of fierce, triumphant pride, and left the room. Clara and Alistair were alone. His hand still held hers on the table, a warm, solid anchor in the wreckage of the evening. He did not let go. "Come," he said, his voice quiet. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. He led her from the dining room, past the portrait of his father, down the hall, and into the library. The fire was burning low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. He did not release her hand. He led her to the center of the room and turned to face her. The air was thick with all the words they had never said, all the feelings they had never shown. "For 12 years, he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I have lived in this house as a ghost. I have let that fire burn me again every single day. I have let my past and my face define me." He raised his free hand, the one that was not holding hers, and touched the edge of his steel mask. "This was my shield, my fortress. I thought it kept the world out. But I see now, it only kept me in." His gaze was fixed on her, intense, unwavering. "You were the first person to enter this house and not look at me with fear, or pity, or morbid curiosity. You looked at me, as if I were just a man." "You are," she whispered. "Just a man, Alistair." His name on her lips was a prayer, a promise. "No one has seen my face since the fire," he said, his voice barely audible. "No one." He watched her, his eye searching hers, asking a silent, terrifying question. She answered it with a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her hand in his was steady. Slowly, with an infinite, deliberate grace, he raised his hand to the fastenings at the back of his head. There was the faint click of a clasp. He brought his hand to his face, and, with a deep, shuddering breath, he removed the mask. He let it fall. It landed on the thick Persian rug with a soft, muffled thud. The sound of a closing door, the end of an era. He stood before her, revealed. The left side of his face was a tapestry of scars. The skin was pulled tight over his cheekbone, pale and silvered in the firelight. His eye was closed, the lid sealed by the old wound, a delicate tracery of lines radiating from it. His mouth was drawn slightly at the corner. It was not monstrous. It was not grotesque. It was a map of pain, a testament to survival. It was the face of a man who had walked through hell and come out the other side. But his other eye, the one she had come to know so well, was open, and it was full of a terrifying vulnerability. He was waiting for the flinch, the gasp, the turning away. Clara did not flinch. She did not gasp. She did not turn away. She simply looked at him. She saw the scars, yes, but they were just lines on a page. She saw the man beneath them, the lonely, grieving, proud and gentle man she had come to know in the silence. She saw Alistair. She let go of his hand and raised her own. With a tenderness that brought tears to his eyes, she gently, so gently, touched the unscarred side of his face. Her fingers were cool against his skin. She felt a tremor run through him. "Alistair," she whispered again. And in that one word, in that one soft touch, he was seen, truly and completely seen for the first time in 12 years. He closed his good eye, leaning into her touch like a man starved of warmth. The walls came down. The fortress crumbled. He was no longer the Iron Duke. He was just Alistair. And he was home. Epilogue. 1 year later, spring had come to Blackwood. The gardens, under Clara's careful and well-funded direction, exploded in a riot of colour. Daffodils and tulips lined the walks, and the climbing roses on the old stone walls were heavy with bud. The house itself no longer felt like it was holding its breath. It was breathing, alive with light and air. Lady Seraphina Vane had left in disgrace the morning after the disastrous dinner party. The story, as such stories do, had spread through the county, though in a form that favoured the new Duchess. She was spoken of with a new respect, a woman of quiet strength and profound dignity, who had won the heart of the reclusive Duke. Alistair no longer wore the mask. Not at Blackwood, at least. Within the walls of his own home and the boundaries of his estate, his face was bare. The staff, who had only ever known him as a masked figure, had quickly grown accustomed to it. They saw not the scars, but the man, the master of the house, who was slowly, tentatively, rejoining the world. He still wore it on the rare occasions he had to travel to London on matters of business, a concession to the cruel curiosity of the ton. But those trips were few. Blackwood was his world, and Clara was his world. They were in the library, the late afternoon sun slanting through the tall windows. Alistair was sitting in a worn leather armchair, a book of poetry open on his lap. Clara sat on a low stool at his feet, her head resting against his knee, mending a tear in one of his riding gloves. The silence between them was no longer empty or charged, but comfortable, a soft blanket woven from 1,000 shared moments. He had been reading aloud, his voice, once so rough, now smoother, richer from daily use. He stopped and marked his place with a finger. Clara looked up at him. In the warm light, his scars were just a part of his landscape, a part of the face she had come to love. He looked down at her, and a small, true smile touched his lips, reaching his eye. It was a sight that still made her heart ache with a quiet joy. "What is it?" she asked softly. "I was just thinking," he said, his hand coming to rest on her hair. "About the contract." Clara stilled, the needle pausing in her hand. The 12 pages of cold, cruel ink that had brought her here. "It was a cage," he said, his fingers gently stroking her hair. A cage of paper and ink designed to keep us apart, to keep me safe in my solitude. He looked around the sunlit room, at her, at the life they had built in the ruins of his grief. It failed. She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit her whole face. She reached up and placed her hand over his on her hair. Or perhaps, she said, it succeeded. He looked at her, a question in his eye. It brought me to you, she explained, and it gave us the silence we needed to learn to listen. He leaned down, and his kiss was as soft and as certain as the coming of spring. It was not the fiery passion of storybooks, but something deeper, stronger, a love that had been earned, a love that was a chosen act of seeing and of being seen. The contract had been a cage of paper and ink, but in the silence between the words, they had found their freedom. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.